For over 1,000 years, Constantinople stood as a jewel of civilization, a city of gold, guarded by walls no army dared challenge. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, Constantinople didn't just survive, it thrived. For nearly a millennium, it was the heart of the Byzantine Empire, a bastion of Orthodox Christianity, trade, art, and learning. It was a city of splendor and contradictions, both deeply Christian and deeply political, defended by walls so mighty they stopped Attila the Hun, Arab armies, and crusaders. But in 1453, the unthinkable happened. Cannons roared, empires clashed, and one of the greatest fortresses the world had ever known fell. This is the history of the rise and fall of Constantinople, where Roman legacy met Ottoman firepower, and the final vestiges of the Roman Empire came to a violent and thunderous end. Founded in 330 AD by Emperor Constantine, Constantinople became the new capital of the Roman Empire, strategically placed on the Bosporus Strait, a bridge between Europe and Asia, between East and West. By the early 4th century, the Roman Empire was on the brink of final fall. Weakened by civil wars, economic collapse, and constant invasions, the once mighty empire struggled to hold itself together. But from the chaos rose a man with a vision. Flavius Valerius Constantinus, better known to history as Constantine the Great. He was a soldier, a statesman, and a shrewd strategist, but above all, Constantine was a man of destiny, with the Western Roman Empire crumbling, Rome itself decaying. Constantine knew he needed a fresh start, a new capital that could withstand the pressures of time, geography, and politics. His eyes turned to the east. There, on a narrow peninsula nestled between Europe and Asia, stood a Greek city known as Byzantium. It was perfectly positioned, strategic for trade, easily defensible, and spiritually symbolic. It was a new Rome, a city that would become the seat of the Christian Empire. Construction began in 324 AD. Temples, forums, palaces, and aqueducts rose where once there was only a sleepy port town. He repurposed Roman art and architecture, importing statues and columns from across the empire. And at its heart, a massive hippodrome for chariot races, a grand palace, and churches, symbols of a new Christian identity. On May 11th, 330 AD, Constantinople was officially dedicated. The new Rome had been born. To bring life to his new capital, Constantine didn't just build walls and palaces, he brought people. He invited settlers from every corner of the Roman Empire, offering special privileges and incentives. Some high-ranking officials were even forced to relocate. But the real draw, a generous offer. Anyone who bought property in the city was guaranteed free grain, oil, and wine. This food bonus, as it became known, was a success. Artisans, sailors, fishermen all came in droves, turning a once modest port into a thriving metropolis. Constantinople wasn't just a capital. It was a living museum of Roman greatness. Constantinople, the new Rome, was the linchpin of the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire. However, it was surrounded by enemies, and so it needed more than just faith and fortune. It needed walls. In 408 AD, under the rule of Emperor Theodosius II, the most ambitious fortification system of the ancient world began. What rose was a triple-layered wall system stretching over 12 kilometers or 7.5 miles. These weren't just walls. They were a fortress themselves, made of a deep moat, a lower outer wall with battlements and small towers, a middle wall with space for archers, and a massive inner wall up to 5 meters thick and 12 meters high, lined with 92 towers spaced at regular intervals. They were the most advanced defensive system the world had ever seen. Over the centuries, wave after wave of invaders tried to breach the walls, the Avars and Persians in 626, the Arabs in the 7th and 8th centuries, the Rus in the 860s, even the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Most failed, and those who succeeded often did so through betrayal, not brute force. The walls turned back armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. They held when plagues swept the empire, when emperors fell, and even when hope was gone. In January of 447, Rome's eastern jewel was rocked by a powerful earthquake. Homes crumbled, churches collapsed, and even the mighty Theodosian walls, the city's first line of defense, lay shattered, but from the rubble rose resilience. Nearly 16,000 citizens rallied to restore what was lost. In just 2 months, they didn't just rebuild. They expanded the city's defenses. A new outer wall, dozens of towers, an embankment, and a deepened moat, lined meticulously with bricks. By spring, Constantinople stood stronger than ever. That same spring, Attila the Hun marched from Thrace, his army rumbling toward the city. Panic swept the population. Many fled, fearing the worst. But when Attila reached the mighty new walls of Constantinople, he hesitated, then turned away, diverting south to Greece. The walls had done more than stand. They had deterred one of history's most feared conquerors. The mid-5th century wasn't just a time of bricks and battlements. It was a turning point for faith. By now, the archbishops of Constantinople carried a new and powerful title, Patriarch. The church was becoming inseparable from the empire. Throughout the early Middle Ages, Constantinople wasn't just a capital. It was the cultural heart of the known world, richer, more educated, and more advanced than any city in Western Europe. Here, trade thrived. Crafts flourished and diplomacy reached distant borders. Byzantine scribes preserved ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, while the city's bureaucrats, highly trained and literate, built a government that relied on logic, law, and learning. This intellectual climate nurtured geography, astronomy, mathematics, rhetoric, linguistics, and even civil law, spurred by legal disputes in a booming economy. The wealth of Constantinople also fueled its arts, architecture, and engineering. The city pushed boundaries, literally raising the skyline. Medicine advanced under the patronage of imperial and church elites. Poetry, theater, music, and hagiography, the writing of saints' lives, all thrived. And in the city's workshops, dazzling mosaics, intricate pottery, fine enamels, and vibrant fabric dyes poured into homes and churches alike. Even as the church's influence grew and challenged so-called pagan traditions, Constantinople never fully surrendered its secular soul. Unlike the West, where education fell under exclusive church control, Constantinople preserved the intellectual spirit of antiquity. In 532 AD, the city came terrifyingly close to falling apart. Not from invaders at its gates, but from chaos within its own walls. At the heart of this turmoil, a riot so violent it nearly brought down an emperor, and from its ashes rose one of the greatest architectural wonders the world has ever seen. When Justinian I ascended the throne in 527, he inherited more than an empire. He inherited a city simmering with unrest. The hippodrome, the city's massive stadium, wasn't just about chariot races. It was the pulse of Constantinople's political life. The 4 main chariot teams, blues, greens, whites, and reds, once mere sporting factions, had evolved into powerful political organizations. But it was the blues and the greens who truly ruled the streets, each backed by different classes and religious leanings. The blues were supported by aristocrats, landowners, and the clergy, while the greens were backed by merchants, tradesmen, and monophysite sympathizers. Their rivalry would eventually erupt into something far more dangerous than sport. January 11th, 532. What began as another day of chariot races quickly descended into rage. The people were furious over high taxes, corruption, and the emperor's crackdown on dissent. The Greens and Blues, normally at odds, united under one chilling cry, "Nika! Nika! Victory! Victory!" The Nika revolt had begun. Within days, Constantinople was engulfed in flames. Prisoners were freed, government offices torched, records destroyed. Even the great churches of St. Sophia and St. Irene were reduced to ash. Over 30,000 rebels swarmed the streets. Justinian's rule was hanging by a thread. The emperor considered fleeing, but it was his wife, the Empress Theodora, who stood firm. In what is now her famous speech, she said in part, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud. I will not flee. If we must die, let us die with dignity." With the help of his generals, Belisarius, Mundus, and the eunuch Narses, Justinian launched a brutal counterattack. On January 18th, soldiers stormed the hippodrome. The bloodshed was catastrophic. When the dust settled, over 35,000 people were dead. The revolt had ended, but Constantinople was a city scarred and broken. To rebuild not just a city, but its spirit, Justinian turned to faith and architecture. Within weeks, he commissioned a brand new cathedral on the ashes of the old St. Sophia. Laborers toiled for nearly 6 years. On Justinian's building project, marble and stone were imported from every corner of the empire. Finally, on December 27th, 537, the new Hagia Sophia was consecrated. As Justinian stepped into its soaring halls and beheld the magnificence of the cathedral, he declared, "O Solomon, I have vanquished thee. Glory to God, who has judged me worthy of such a work." It wasn't just a church. It was a symbol of resilience, of divine right, of imperial power rising from the ashes. Today, the Hagia Sophia still stands, weathering centuries of conquest, conversion, and change. But beneath its dome lies the story of a city almost lost, and an emperor who rebuilt it in fire and faith. This was Constantinople in crisis, and its rebirth became legend. By the end of Emperor Justinian's reign, the Byzantine Empire stood at the pinnacle of its power. From the sun-scorched shores of North Africa to the marble ruins of Italy, from the rugged hills of Armenia to the southern reaches of Spain and the coast of Dalmatia, Justinian had stitched together an empire that echoed the glory of ancient Rome. Constantinople was a glittering capital of wealth and splendor, a city where gold flowed as easily as grain, where taxes from across the empire poured into the imperial coffers and military spoils from distant campaigns marched through its gates. The city was a vibrant mosaic of cultures and peoples, Slavs and Thracians, Armenians and Copts, Goths, Arabs, Jews and Italians. Many arrived as strangers, but most, over time, adopted the Greek tongue, embraced the Orthodox faith, and folded into the traditions of Byzantine life. Under Justinian, the emperor's word became law, absolute and unquestionable. He cemented the concept that the emperor and the church were intertwined. The Orthodox Church gained unprecedented privilege, and the ancient Roman institutions gave way to a new, distinctly Byzantine form of governance. But even in an age of triumph, shadows loomed. In 541, a mysterious plague, what history would call the Plague of Justinian, swept the empire. At its peak, thousands of people died each day in Constantinople alone. The vibrant heart of the empire was brought to its knees. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the disease. However, he was numbered among the few who survived its onslaught. The pandemic would claim nearly a fifth of the capital's population, leaving the city haunted and hollowed. But fate was not finished with Constantinople. In 557 and again in 558, powerful earthquakes rocked the imperial capital. Stately buildings crumbled. The mighty Hagia Sophia, the emperor's own crown jewel, suffered severe damage. Even the revered monastery of St. Michael in the ancient Chora church cracked under the earth's fury. What Justinian had built in stone and spirit would endure, but not without scars. The emperor who dreamed of restoring Rome had, in truth, forged something entirely new. A Christian empire in the Greek-speaking East, a world ruled not by the Senate, but by a sacred sovereign and a celestial mission. The Roman Empire may have fallen in the West, but in Constantinople it had been reborn as Byzantine, brilliant and burning with ambition. In the spring of 717 AD, the mighty city of Constantinople stood at the edge of annihilation once again. A new emperor had seized the throne, Leo III, the Isaurian, a hardened general of Armenian descent. But as he crowned himself ruler, fate delivered a storm unlike any before. A colossal Arab force, led by the fearsome Maslama ibn Abdul Malik, marched from the east. They dug deep trenches at the foot of the great Theodosian walls, erecting siege engines and stone fortifications. The city, encircled and isolated, braced for catastrophe. From the sea, nearly 1,800 Arab ships sailed into the Bosphorus. But Constantinople had a secret weapon: Greek fire. Greek fire was a highly flammable, almost legendary, incendiary weapon developed by the Byzantine Empire in the late 7th century, most famously used in naval warfare. Its exact chemical composition remains one of history's great military secrets, so closely guarded that it was lost to time. Unlike ordinary fire, Greek fire could ignite even on water, making it devastating against enemy ships. It was usually projected through special bronze tubes called siphons mounted on ships, but it could also be deployed in jars or grenades hurled by catapult or hand. In a blaze of heat and horror, the Byzantine navy unleashed liquid flames, engulfing enemy ships in roaring infernos. Then came winter, bitter, brutal, unforgiving. The Arab besiegers faced famine. Men died in droves, and as spring returned, so did death, their reinforcements crushed by the Byzantines. On August 15th, 718, after more than a year of siege, fire, and famine, the Arabs lifted their siege and retreated. Constantinople had survived once more. But victory came at a cost. The empire was weary, its capital scarred. By the mid-8th century, Constantinople had declined in population, ravaged by war and plague. The aqueduct of Valens, destroyed during the Avar siege of 626, still lay in ruin. Egyptian grain imports had ceased. Bread was scarce, water scarcer. But make no mistake, the city's influence only grew. It was a melting pot of cultures. Slavs, Arabs, Jews, and Armenians settled in the capital. Most adopted the Greek language, converted to Orthodoxy, and embraced Byzantine traditions. Though its global dominance had dimmed since Justinian's reign, within the Byzantine world, Constantinople remained the king of cities, the eye of the universe. Then came Leo's most controversial act. In 726, he issued an edict banning the veneration of icons, sacred images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints. What followed was a civil war in all but name. Iconoclasts, those who supported Leo's decree, clashed bitterly with iconodules, the worshippers of icons. Monasteries became battlegrounds. Thousands of icons, frescoes, and mosaics were destroyed. Monks were tortured, imprisoned, exiled, and even executed. Irene of Athens rose to power at a pivotal moment in Byzantine history. The wife of Emperor Leo IV, she became regent in 780. Upon his death, acting as guardian and co-ruler for their 10-year-old son, Constantine VI. Almost immediately, Irene faced a A conspiracy by iconoclasts, opponents of religious images, attempted to install Leo's half-brother, Nicephorus, on the throne. Irene decisively crushed the plot, solidifying her authority. A devout supporter of the use of religious icons, Irene moved swiftly to undo decades of iconoclast policy. The veneration of icons had been banned since 730, but Irene sought to reverse this. She appointed her ally, Tarasius, as Patriarch of Constantinople and convened a church council in 787. This meeting, now recognized as the Seventh Ecumenical Council, formally restored the veneration of icons in 787, a decision accepted by both the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. As Constantine VI grew older, tensions with his mother deepened. He chafed under her control and eventually tried to assert his independence. Some factions proclaimed Constantine as sole emperor, and Irene was temporarily exiled from court. But her absence was brief. In 792, Irene was restored as co-emperor, and through political maneuvering and alliances with church leaders and court officials, she gradually regained dominance. Finally, in 797, she orchestrated her son's arrest and had him blinded, a common Byzantine method of disqualification. Afterward, Constantine VI disappears from the historical record, likely dying from his wounds. Now without a rival, Irene ruled alone, not as empress consort or regent, but as emperor in her own right, the first woman in Byzantine history to do so. Her reign lasted another 5 years. In 798, she reached out to the west, opening diplomatic ties with Charlemagne, who had recently been crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Rumors even circulated of a proposed marriage alliance between Irene and Charlemagne, which would have united East and West. According to the chronicler Theophanes, the plan was sabotaged by one of Irene's own favorites. Irene's ambitious rule gained her many powerful enemies. Finally, she was overthrown in a palace coup, led by officials and generals. The throne passed to Nicephorus, the empire's finance minister. Irene was exiled first to the island of Principe and later to Lesbos, where she lived out her remaining years in obscurity. Her staunch defense of religious icons and support for monasticism earned her canonization in the Greek Orthodox Church. Today, she is remembered as Saint Irene. Through fire and famine, siege and schism, Constantinople endured, a city of contradictions, sacred and brutal, enlightened and oppressive, a place where emperors rose, fell, and bled. In the year 879, a new chapter began in the storied history of Constantinople. A council held in the Hagia Sophia reaffirmed the Nicene Creed, once again deepening the rift between East and West, and religious unity unraveled. Disputes between the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope of Rome escalated. The theology of the Eastern and Western churches followed very different paths. In the East, theology was deeply shaped by Greek philosophy, emphasizing mystery, contemplation, and the divine nature. In the West, much of theology was influenced by Roman law. It was focused on structure, authority, and legal definitions. These differences eventually led to serious misunderstandings, especially over one central belief: the procession of the Holy Spirit. Did the Spirit proceed from the Father alone, as the East taught, or from both the Father and the Son, as the West began to claim? Without any consultation with the Eastern churches, the Roman Church added the phrase "and the Son" to the Nicene Creed. The East saw this as an overreach and a theological error. Tensions deepened over other issues too. The Eastern churches resented Rome's push for mandatory celibacy among priests, its restriction of the sacrament of confirmation to bishops alone, and its use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist. These growing divisions weren't just doctrinal. They were cultural, political, and deeply felt. and they would ultimately lead to the Great Schism. In 1054, Cardinal Humbert, under Pope Leo's authority, excommunicated Patriarch Michael Cerularius. Cerularius responded in kind. The Great Schism had begun, and there was a formal split between Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. Despite the tension, Constantinople remained the beacon of culture. Under Constantine VII, the empire compiled vast encyclopedias of knowledge. Artists crafted ivory icons, colorful mosaics, and radiant manuscripts, shaping the identity of Byzantium. This was Constantinople at the height of its glory, a city of emperors and merchants, saints and heretics, warriors and philosophers, the eye of the universe, the queen of cities, a jewel of civilization that defied time itself. In the year 1185, a new dynasty rose to power in the Byzantine Empire. Isaac II Angelos ascended the throne with the help of a rebellious mob, toppling the Varangian Guard and storming the great imperial palace. Isaac II Angelos rose to power almost by accident. The people of Constantinople, enraged by the cruelty and tyranny of Emperor Andronikos I Komnenos, turned against their ruler in a violent revolt. Andronikos was brutally killed by the mob, and Isaac, who had been a relatively minor noble, was swept into power as emperor in his place. At first, Isaac's reign showed promise. He successfully repelled a Norman invasion shortly after taking the throne and managed to suppress several rebellious generals challenging his authority. These early victories offered hope for stability, but the promise quickly faded. Isaac's rule was soon marked by chaos and decline. One of the most devastating blows came from the north, where the Vlachs and Bulgarians launched a massive uprising, eventually breaking free from Byzantine control and establishing an independent Bulgarian state. Internally, the empire was plagued by repeated revolts, while externally it faced invasion and military humiliation. After a decade of weak and ineffective rule, Isaac's reign came to a bitter end in 1195. His own brother, Alexios, overthrew him in a coup, blinded him, and took the throne as Alexios III. Remarkably, Isaac would return to power in 1203, restored by the forces of the Fourth Crusade and accompanied by his son, Alexios IV. Their restoration, however, was short-lived. In January 1203, the Fourth Crusade, originally bound for Jerusalem, took a dramatic and fateful turn. The Crusader leadership struck a secret deal with the Byzantine prince Alexios Angelos, the son of the then deposed Emperor Isaac II. In exchange for their support in reclaiming the throne, Alexios promised the Crusaders vast sums of money, military assistance, and naval support for their campaign in the Holy Land. On June 23, 1203, the main Crusader fleet arrived before the imposing walls of Constantinople. By August, after skirmishes and pressure from the Crusaders, Alexios Angelos was installed as co-emperor, Alexios IV, ruling alongside his restored father. But his reign quickly faltered. By January 1204, discontent within Constantinople exploded into open rebellion. The unpopular Alexios IV was overthrown, and on February 8, 1204, he was murdered. His father died shortly after, and the city plunged into political chaos. With no emperor to honor the financial promises made to them and tensions rising, the Crusaders, along with their Venetian allies, decided on full-scale conquest. In April 1204, they launched a brutal assault on Constantinople, capturing and mercilessly sacking the city. Constantinople, the queen of cities, had fallen, not to Persians, not to Arabs, but to fellow Christians. The Crusaders unleashed horror. The pillaging that followed defied belief. Churches and palaces were stripped bare. Gold, silver, silk, icons and manuscripts were all taken. Even the tombs of emperors and patriarchs were violated. Statues were melted for coin. priceless bronzes from the hippodrome were destroyed. The sacking of Constantinople marked the end of a golden age. A city that had stood for nearly 1,000 years was humbled by fire and greed. It would never again reclaim its former glory. The once mighty Constantinople, jewel of the Byzantine world, had been ravaged. The fire, greed, and violence of 1204 left the empire crippled. Its golden age was over, and a new dark chapter had begun. What followed was the establishment of a new Latin empire and the division of Byzantine lands among the victors. Though the Byzantine Empire had suffered a crippling blow, it was not entirely extinguished. Resistance continued in unconquered regions like Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. In 1261, the Empire of Nicaea successfully retook Constantinople, restoring Byzantine rule. The Fourth Crusade remains one of the most controversial events in medieval history. Instead of uniting Christendom, it deepened the divide between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. More than that, it marked a turning point in the decline of the Byzantine Empire and the weakening of Christian power in the Eastern Mediterranean. In 1451, a young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless sultan ascended the Ottoman throne. Mehmed II. Barely 20 years old, he would soon set his sights on a prize unmatched in prestige and power: Constantinople, the crown jewel of Byzantium. Before the cannons thundered and the walls shook, Mehmed's conquest began with diplomacy. Treaties with Western neighbors secured his borders. In Asia Minor, he subdued Karaman, a rebellious rival, consolidating Ottoman control. Besieged by enemies, the Byzantine Empire looked westward in desperation, hoping for salvation. But the Catholic West, led by the Pope, offered a condition. No help would come unless the Byzantines agreed to unite with the Latin Church and accept Catholic doctrine. While several officials were willing to make this theological concession to preserve the empire, the people of Byzantium were not. The deep scars left by the brutal sack of Constantinople in 1204 remained unhealed. To the Orthodox populace, Catholicism was not salvation, it was betrayal. Each attempt to reconcile with Rome only sparked outrage and riots in the streets. Theological differences, already centuries in the making, fueled further hostility. As Byzantium squabbled internally over religion and power, a far greater threat advanced steadily: the Ottomans. They crossed into Europe and swallowed up the empire's remaining territories one by one. By the dawn of the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than the city of Constantinople itself, a fragile remnant of an imperial past. It became increasingly clear that only united Christian support from the West could stop the Ottoman advance. But that support came at the same price: submission to Catholic authority. For many Byzantines, this was unthinkable. A saying at the time captured their defiance: better the Turkish turban than the papal tiara. For them, it was preferable to be ruled by the Muslim Turks than to abandon Orthodox Christianity. Yet the emperors saw the writing on the wall. In 1439, Emperor John VIII Palaiologos and leading Orthodox bishops agreed to a union with the Catholic Church at the Council of Florence. But when they returned home, they were met not with gratitude, but with fury. The Orthodox faithful rejected the agreement outright, viewing it as a betrayal of their faith. Bishops were attacked. The rift deepened. By the mid-15th century, Constantinople was a ghost of its former self. Its once mighty walls now enclosed a city whose population had dwindled to a fraction of its glory days. Scattered villages, broken up by open fields. Then, on April 2nd, 1453, a massive Ottoman force, 80,000 strong, arrived at the gates of Constantinople. Leading them was a young but determined ruler, Sultan Mehmed II. Inside the city, just 7,000 defenders prepared for a last stand. Only 2,000 of them sent from the west. Despite the odds, they resisted for nearly 2 months. But on May 29, 1453, the walls were finally breached. The last emperor of Byzantium, Constantine XI, famously cast off his imperial robes and charged into the fray. He was never seen again. After the fall of Constantinople, Mehmed II entered the city in triumph at just 21. He had ended an empire that had lasted over 1,000 years, and from its ashes, he would forge a new legacy, the mighty Ottoman Empire. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the final chapter of the Roman Empire. It also delivered a crushing blow to Christendom. With no orthodox power remaining to oppose them, the Ottoman armies could now press deeper into Europe. Sultan Mehmed II moved the Ottoman capital from Edirne to Constantinople and began transforming the ancient city into a center of Islamic power. Churches became mosques, and in time, Constantinople became known as Istanbul, the heart of a new empire. Up next, Boudica, the warrior queen who burned Roman cities to the ground.